Hello, I'm Harry Harding. I'm the Dean of the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy here at the University of Virginia. And I'm delighted to have this chance to conduct a very informal interview with Laurin Henry, who not only is a former member of the UVA faculty, but was one of the founding leaders and one of the very first presidents of the National Association of Schools of Public Affairs and Administration. And we originally began meeting each other on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of NASPAA. Professor Henry, NASPAA was organized in a sense a little bit late, 1970. American universities have been teaching public administration for how long at that point? When did that field begin as a field of study in American universities?
It probably began in a small way in the late 1920s. And got a boost in the 30s with the New Deal and a rise of consciousness of government programs. A dozen or so of the pioneer public administration professors went to Washington during World War II and got great experience, and then came back to the universities in the 40s, so that it was building slowly through the 40s and 50s, but still very slowly and falling behind what most of the people in the field saw as the needs of the government and the needs of the time.
Mm-hmm. When you say falling behind, the needs in what way? Just in terms of numbers of people being graduated, or the skills and substantive knowledge they had?
Some of both, but I suppose they were thinking mostly in terms of numbers. You see that by the 1960s, the scene of government was changing again. In that we had the great growth of new programs under the Johnson administration, Medicare, environmental legislation, Vietnam War. Government was growing and needing new people trained at a higher level and new skills. And although there were a number of new public administration programs and schools being founded, the number was lagging behind, it was thought. And public affairs was not sharing in the just fantastic growth of higher education during that period.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that public administration as a field began to develop as the growth of government produced a greater need for civil servants. When was the public policy component added? In other words, not just training people to implement decisions that were made by political leaders at a higher level, but actually be involved in shaping of those decisions, whether from inside or outside government?
Well, I think the leaders of the field, almost from the beginning, never fully accepted the public perception that they were interested only in narrow implementation. But the aspiration to share in policy making and feeling that they had something to contribute, I think got a great boost during World War II when many public administration people were involved at pretty high levels in Washington. Then another sort of boost of this began in the early 60s with the arrival of McNamara at the Department of Defense and the emphasis on analysis and quantitative methods, and that seeped over into the university world in the middle 1960s, so that when we get to the time of the founding of NASPAA in the late 60s, there were emerging a small group of university programs which considered themselves public policy schools and sought to distinguish themselves intellectually from the older traditions.
Now, my perception is that basically that has produced kind of two different kinds of schools. There are still schools of public administration and there are schools of public policy. And obviously you can't do everything in a single curriculum. But did we lose something by basically having two separate degrees, an MPP and an MPA?
Well, I suspect that we did. I was never one who had the skills or identified himself especially as a public policy specialist. I guess I wouldn't accept the premise that those two approaches are intellectually incompatible and can't be combined, although it's hard to do everything in the amount of time that you have available in a master's degree curriculum.
Now, buried in NASPAA's name, I shouldn't say buried, an integral part of its name is this other phrase, public affairs. And I've always wondered what the distinction is among these three terms: public policy, public administration, and public affairs. What's public affairs?
I think public affairs is a great imprecise term designed as an umbrella to encompass all these other things. To my mind, the best thinkers in public administration would have considered the two terms synonymous, although later there became people who sought to consign public administration to a narrow concept of program delivery, not a concept that I personally would embrace.
Now, what was then the motivation in the late 1960s? This is, as you've said, 30 plus years after the first teaching of public administration in American universities. What was the motivation to pull the programs together into a national association?
Well, the people who had been running these schools and programs simply felt that public administration, public affairs schools were not growing apace with the need of the government in the 1960s, as all sorts of new governmental programs were created. And they saw higher education growing rapidly, and they felt that they were being left behind. That is, that although there were some new schools of public administration or public affairs being created, they were small in number, and the public administration / public affairs people had the feeling that if they didn't do something to not only expand the field but create some order in terms of standards and agreement about what the field ought to have, that they were going to be left behind by all this growth and remain a permanent satellite of political science departments, or even worse, tails on the kite of the business schools, which were very high flying in this time.
Right, right. Now, how did they try to achieve that objective of increasing the size and increasing the status of schools of public policy and administration?
Well, it was hoped that this new organization could speak forcefully and authoritatively both to the leaders of higher education and to the leaders of government about the need for more and better trained professional public servants. And they hoped particularly to make their message more credible by the establishment of some standards of what an appropriate education for public service would be. There were at that time a great variety of these programs, some probably the majority subordinate in political science departments, but there were some attached to business schools. There were some which combined international affairs and criminal justice. There was a great mishmash of names and approaches, and it was hoped that a new organization could establish some uniformity and thereby gain more credibility for its claims for more support.
As you know, I served for 10 years as the Dean of the School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and one of the things I really envied the business schools was that they had branded themselves with a single degree name, the Master of Business Administration. In fact, I find that young people these days are more likely to say MBA school than they are to say business school. They actually now call it by the name of the degree. International Affairs, there's never been a standardized name. There are Masters of International Affairs, there's Masters of Science and Foreign Service, Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy. Maybe some of our viewers will recognize the schools that offer these. My sense is that there is a degree of standardization in NASPAA's areas. There's MPP and there's MPA, but there's also Master of Public Affairs. To what extent was standardization of degrees one of the efforts to kind of brand and raise the image, the reputation of NASPAA schools?
I don't recall that discussion of degree titles much entered in it. I guess that would have been implicit in some establishment of standards. I think at that time, if anybody would have asked, they would have said that the MPA was the gold standard.
With PA standing for public administration rather than public affairs, I assume, or not?
Optional.
according to the same abbreviation for two different degrees.
All of these titles and approaches are so much influenced by local history and the universities that it's hard to generalize about it.
Now, did this ever involve a push for some kind of federal funding for schools?
Indeed.
And what form did that ever happen? What form did it take?
It happened for a while. Yes, that was very much in mind. See, one of the early higher education acts of what would have been 1965 authorized a federal program of funding for graduate study for the public service. It was authorized but never funded. The Budget Bureau kept killing the appropriation. And one of the goals of the leaders was to get that thing funded, which eventually was done along about 1975 or 6. It was pushed through after the Nixon administration, which had stood out firmly against it, or at least its budget directors had. But with a great feat of lobbying in around 1976, that was funded for a while. I'm not sure at what point it ended, and it never was done on a scale equivalent to what people had hoped, or for that matter, that Lyndon Johnson had seemed to promise in a famous speech at Princeton in 1965 when he talked about the need for a great expansion of education and training for the public service.
Right. Now, what about state governments? They have an equal interest in training people to do public policy, public affairs, public administration. Have they ever funded, other than by funding public colleges and universities that may offer the degree, has there been any help from the state governments in this area?
Not that I know of in special support for such schools. Such schools have at times and in some locations benefited in other ways by a close association with state government, as for example we did in my time at VCU in Richmond, where we had very close relations with the state government to our mutual benefit, I think. But that's generally not taken the form of sort of mainline hard money funding for either general academic programs or, for that matter, student support.
But it might be just the benefits of interaction, possibly project grants, internships.
Project grants, internships, consultations, that whole variety of things.
Skipping now forward to the present and looking a bit ahead, if I, as a still fairly new, been around for about a year and a couple of months, but who's counting, as a new dean of a school, in my case of public policy, what advice would you give? How has the process, the profession, the school evolved, and what should a new dean be aware of? How is the environment changing? How are the opportunities and challenges different now than they would have been 10, 15, or 40 years ago?
Well, I have to begin with an apology for having been kind of outside the mainstream of these events now for longer than I like to realize. I guess my view of or what I thought of as one of the critical issues of deaning, at least in my time, was to establish an appropriate relationships with the other departments and disciplines that need to feed into a school of public affairs or public service. You have to have, in my view, in the School of Public Affairs, a critical mass of faculty and students who are devoted primarily to that enterprise. But to keep this in complete isolation from the mainstream of thought in political science and economics and other things, I think leads ultimately to sterility